Hi, I'm David Singleton, partner and founder of L2 Fluency, along with Paul May, bringing you the November edition of The Greek Peak. This month, we will be exploring the theme, What's Under the Surface, Part 2, using again verses 31 to 32 of Matthew 5 as a basis for our investigation. Join us for God's decent people as we analyze the Greek language to understand what Jesus pointedly tells Jewish people about trying to keep the law. Sometimes our focus is on something right in front of us. We can appreciate its beauty, simplicity, and significance because we are fixated on the details of something minute. But as we zoom out beyond what we can see in front of us, we are struck by that environment now appearing inside the larger view. We can see the whole and understand why the smaller focus was so beautiful, simple, or significant to us. We gain insight because we see a bigger picture. That is precisely what happens with the passage in Matthew 5, 31 and 32. We perhaps understand the passage a certain way, but seeing a fuller context gives us new understanding and appreciation for how two verses fit into an overall group of verses. As we begin to read chapter 5 of Matthew, we notice that verses 3 to 12 start exactly the same way. Most translations render makarioi, the initial word of the pattern, as blessed, happy, or fortunate. It means God's favor. The pattern is easy to see, and they highlight godly attributes such as a pure heart, a merciful attitude, a desire to bring peace, the ability to walk humbly, among others. The attributes all bestow a reward to the one who exhibits it. The pattern was most likely used as a way of remembering what was said so that it could be passed on through easy memorization. Years later, its form could be trusted for its authenticity. As we continue reading in Matthew 5, a distinct pattern surfaces in a second section starting with verse 20. This time, the pattern begins with Jesus indirectly quoting the Old Testament, and immediately following, he either refers to the people's behavior that violates basic decency to others or refers to the quoted law's underlying intent. Showing how the pattern is constructed gives perspective for understanding what was said. First, we see two verses that serve as an introduction and a conclusion to the pattern. He wants us to set ourselves apart by doing more than the minimal goodness. Second, we have two verses that appear as major points. They are marked with the words, "You have heard that it was said to the ancient ones." Third, we see two minor points under each of the major points. Three of the points are marked with, "You have heard that it was said," and one point is reduced to, "It was said," because it seems to be a subpoint to the minor point. The skeletal outline makes it easy to see the quotation from the Old Testament using an expression containing erethe, "it was said," and the reaction of Jesus to the quoted portion, "ego dilego human," "I'm telling you." The skeletal outline of the verses of the second major point and its subpoints bear out the identical structure as the first major point. For each verse in the Old Testament, the "it was said" portion, Jesus responds with, "I'm telling you." The meaning becomes clear in Jesus' explanation of each Old Testament verse. Following the law has some underlying principles or steps of decency that, when lived out, never allow the stage of behavior to be reached where people need to hawkishly monitor whether or not the law is being followed. Decent behavior precludes the need for the law. It's simply a lifestyle of doing things the right way. For example, verse 21 states that the law prohibits murder. However, if you are living according to God's lifestyle of decency, the level of anger required of a person to murder someone would never be attained. Again in verse 29, Jesus says the law prohibits adultery. But God's lifestyle of decency would never allow for a man to get to the point of desiring a woman as strongly as he desires his wife, because his commitment level to God and to his wife guards his heart from a stray erotic gaze. The remaining 4 quotations and responses follow the same pattern and meaning. If we inspect the subject of our study, verses 31 and 32, to see if their proposed meaning matches the meaning of the previous point in the section, our understanding increases. If they match, we see that verses 29 and 30 broach the subject of adultery, leading to verses 31 and 32, which highlight how men were using divorce to be a springboard to taking on a new woman. A lifestyle of treating women the right way, that is, by not jumping out of marriage at all, like responsible and committed men do, would lead to a more godly way of living. If we follow the same pattern all the way to the end of the section and jump to the 6th and final quotation from the Old Testament in verse 43, we can check this pattern to see if it holds. Jesus starts with people's understanding of the verse. In ancient times, it was said to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Then he explains that understanding Leviticus 19:18 should have a different insight. Underlying the intent of loving one's neighbor as oneself is the idea of loving everyone, not merely one's own people versus everyone else. In fact, a lifestyle of decency would guide a person to treat all people, those who belong to the faith or not, as a neighbor, even praying for them. God gives equal treatment to everyone on earth by providing sunshine and rain for them all. Why wouldn't we do the same? The pattern holds. The Jews of Jesus' time, particularly the leaders and teachers of the Old Testament, received a lesson in irony from Jesus. They learned that being meticulous about their traditions ironically led them away from God's heart. Clasping to the law in such an unbending fashion caused their hearts to become callous to the loving nature of God. God wanted his people to show his heart. By having what was best for themselves and others, all others, embedded in their own hearts, God's heart could be demonstrated. But there was a hint of something else in Jesus' comments. Not only did Jesus want the Jews to know that they had missed the intent of God's original dealings with the Hebrews receiving the law, he wanted them to know the self-righteous nature of holding fastidiously to the law. Jesus expressed this in verse 20 with a comment about how to view the righteousness of the Pharisees and the scholars of the law. What translators have rendered as the word righteousness is best understood as the right way to live, or a lifestyle of decency. Holding the line in a very subjective way of following the law had led to an arbitrary way of following what God wanted. That is, there was a lot of hypocrisy going on. Each of the 6 references to the Old Testament allowed Jesus to give examples of the hypocrisy in how people acted on some of the law's main applications. Lack of concern for fellow humans was rampant and evident in each example. And that was Jesus' point for the whole section. He started with the problem of anger in verse 21. It shouldn't have had to result in a law for murder. It should have been handled before it rose to that level. In verse 29, there shouldn't have had to be a law against adultery. Why would it have risen to the level of a law if men's hearts for their wives had been in the right place? Next, he targeted divorce in verses 31 and 32, which would never have been a problem if men had not been gazing at women other than their wives with erotic notions. Such a heart had led them to rid themselves of their wives because the pastures were greener on the other side. How hypocritical was that, to follow the law for allowing divorce based on men's underlying desires for someone other than their chosen one from youth. And each of the 6 laws Jesus selected showed that people duplicitously practiced them when they could just be decent with each other and not train themselves in where parameters were and how far they could take a particular behavior. One more clue helps to understand Matthew 5:31 to 32 in light of a larger whole. Jesus knew the people had been taught to follow the law so that they could be right with God. So he introduced and concluded this patterned section with statements of how to take his comments. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees had taught rule keeping with an eye toward loopholes to justify their actions when needing to depart from them. Thus, Jesus led into referring to some of the law's main points by telling the people that their dikaiosune, that is, their decency or righteousness as it appears in nearly all modern versions, should exceed the decency of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Verse 20. Otherwise, actions arise from tainted, wicked hearts to either perform at a minimal level of decency or to circumvent the law when convenient. The entire section ended with a comment to be perfect as their Father in heaven was perfect. Verse 48. Out of all modern translations, only the Message uses modern English expressions to explain the idea of perfect. The comment is not as easily understood as translators seem to think it is. Modern versions render the Greek word teleoi as perfect. If Jesus' point was about doing a better job of rule keeping, then perfect is a good word choice for translators. However, if Jesus was trying to make the point about maintaining a lifestyle of decency, the word he uses would mean the opposite of picking and choosing what laws to fulfill in arbitrary ways. Living decently with one's fellow humans would mean living the right way, all the time. The idea of being consistent over time is preferred over perfect. One other language note is in order while we talk about Jesus' conclusion to this section. He was quoting from Leviticus 19 for his last 3 points. He also found in Leviticus 19, verse 2, God says for the Hebrews to be hagios, as he is hagios. Translations typically use the word holy for hagios. It means other than, higher than, or apart from. This meaning is very much in line with the introduction Jesus gave to this section of the people's decency to be above and beyond that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. Another way to see it is for the people to keep themselves apart from the Pharisees' behavior by acting more like God, not bogged down in the quagmire of keeping rules, especially when the rules were used in such an arbitrary manner. The entire section of Matthew 5 from verse 17 to 48 is all about being decent like God, holy, or decent, or perfect. Words for showing God's heart by consistently acting right toward others. A person cannot miss the ironic nature of this whole section of Matthew 5. Following the law doesn't produce hearts that lead to a lifestyle of decent living. A heart imbued with God's nature, however, leads to a consistent life, which doesn't really need parameters around it. Our Father in heaven, give us opportunities to demonstrate that we can consistently show goodness and decency to others on every occasion, just like you.